Jack Nicholson. A name that doesn't just echo through cinema, it scorches it. A man who could freeze you with a single stare in The Shining, make your heart ache in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and haunt your dreams in Batman. He didn't just act, he dominated every frame, bending fear, charm, and genius into a force all his own. Nicholson was more than an icon, he was a legend who left the world trembling, laughing, and utterly captivated. Jack Nicholson was more than an actor, he was a tempest incarnate, a collision of genius, intensity, and raw humanity that redefined what it meant to perform. His eyes held both madness and brilliance, his voice carved lines into eternity, and every role he touched became immortal. He didn't merely act, he transcended, claiming a place among Hollywood's eternal giants. For decades, he was unstoppable, a force of nature sweeping through awards, commanding reverence, and shaping generations of performers in his shadow. And now, at 88, the legend stands in a quieter, more fragile form. The roar of the audience has faded, replaced by a heavy silence, one that carries the weight of decades, the mystery of a life lived at the edge of brilliance, and the haunting question, what remains of the fire that once could ignite the world? Whispers of decline swirl around him, shadows creeping into the corners of a life that once seemed untouchable. Even Jack Nicholson's legendary willpower cannot fully silence the storm gathering in these twilight years, a storm the world has only begun to sense. What grief now weighs on the shoulders of a man who once stood untouchable? What unseen burden presses against the heart of a living icon? Behind the closed doors of his sanctuary, Nicholson faces a chapter written not in triumph, but in sorrow. And the truth of it aches to be revealed. If his brilliance ever moved you, honor it now with a click of like, a simple gesture for a talent unlike any other. But the story begins in shadow. Imagine discovering in your youth that the woman you believed to be your sister was your mother, that the grandparents you adored were your true parents, a life shaped by secrecy and hidden truths. Born in April 1937 in Neptune, New Jersey, Jack Nicholson entered the world under a veil that would leave lasting scars, forging the complex man behind the legend. His mother, June Nicholson, was a dancer at just 17, too young and too delicate to care for him. The identity of his father remained a mystery, a gap that fame and wealth could never bridge. To protect the family from scandal, his grandparents took him in, raising Jack as if he were their own son, while his biological mother was presented to him as his sister. On the outside, the home appeared warm and typical, but underneath lay a deception so deep that it would eventually unravel his entire sense of identity. When he was merely 4 years old, June departed to chase her own aspirations. The boy who thought she was his sister could never comprehend why she had disappeared from his life. That quiet absence carved out a hollow space within him. A space filled not with hatred, but with profound confusion. A wound far too deep for a child to articulate. For decades, he grew, laughed, worked, and dreamed, unaware that the foundation of his identity was a mirage. Then in 1974, when Jack had already become one of Hollywood's shining stars, a reporter from Time magazine uncovered the truth. The woman he believed to be his sister was actually his mother. And the parents he cherished were, in reality, his grandparents. This was more than just a revelation, it was a collapse, a knife to the soul of a man who had spent nearly 40 years living a narrative crafted by others. Nicholson would later confess that it was an incredibly dramatic event. A shock so profound that he likened it to a blade across the soul that never fully healed. Imagine the cruelty of discovering that the very bedrock of your existence had been constructed on silence and shadows. Many men would have been shattered, lost, or embittered by such a revelation. Yet Jack transformed that wound into a source of fire. The rage, the sorrow, the silent ache, they became the fire that forged performances the world would never forget. In the haunted corridors of The Shining, in the defiant roar of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, in the dark magnetism of Batman, you could see the storm within him. A man forever shadowed by the child he once was, whispering endlessly, "Who am I? Where do I come from?" That unanswerable question ignited his eyes, infused his voice, and carved the unforgettable depth of his soul onto every frame. Yet Nicholson's story is not only one of pain, it is a testament to resilience. He refused to be defined by abandonment. He refused to crumble beneath secrecy and betrayal. Instead, he transformed confusion into creativity, grief into greatness, wounds into timeless art. And even later in life, when confronted with the truths of his past, Jack faced them not with bitterness, but with the quiet, relentless strength that made him a legend. He spoke with a voice forged of weary steel, acknowledging both the pain and the quiet resilience that had carried him through. It was dramatic, but not traumatizing, he said, a simple phrase that belied the storm beneath. In those words lies the paradox of Nicholson's childhood: scar and strength, fracture and flame. A life marked by absence, deception, and secrecy, yet from that darkness emerged a brilliance that would forever reshape cinema. Without that wound, the world might never have known the Jack Nicholson capable of turning pain into immortal art. What drives a boy haunted by secrets and abandonment to chase a dream as merciless and uncertain as Hollywood? At just 17, in 1954, Nicholson left behind the shattered remnants of his New Jersey upbringing and stepped onto California soil. A young man burdened with invisible wounds and carrying ambitions few could imagine. His first job was not on a film set or under the glare of a spotlight, but as an office boy at Hanna-Barbera, running errands, delivering scripts, and watching the magic of animation unfold. Behind those quiet observations, a promise took shape: one day, he would step through the door not as a bystander, but as the master of the stage. He later admitted with a wry, knowing smile, "I always knew I was meant for more than carrying coffee." But in those early years, all he had was hunger and grit. By the age of 21, in 1958, Nicholson finally broke into film with his first starring role in Crybaby Killer, a low-budget B-movie now barely remembered by history. A crime thriller dismissed by critics and audiences alike. Yet to Nicholson, it was monumental. It was proof that he had stepped onto the stage of destiny. Looking back, he would laugh and call it a terrible little movie, but beneath the humor lay the relief of a young man who had finally pierced the wall between dream and reality. The decade that followed offered no easy ascent. Jack's career stalled, and survival demanded ingenuity. He turned to writing, even penning the psychedelic script for The Trip in 1967, while working tirelessly on Roger Corman's low-budget productions. These shoestring films were often mocked, but for Nicholson, they were crucibles, places where raw talent was tempered into mastery, and where the fire that would define a legend began to burn. He learned to improvise, to create intensity out of nothing, and to fight with nothing but his own will in smoky sets and messy backlots. He then admitted, "I never had it easy in this town, but I never stopped showing up." This demonstrates his unwavering perseverance, which set him apart from those who gave up. Then came 1969. Nicholson burst onto the screen at 32 in the countercultural masterwork Easy Rider, delivering a performance so erratic and vibrant that both critics and viewers were enthralled. The boy who used to carry other people's scripts became the man that every studio wanted in an instant. His smile and unadulterated energy left a mark on a generation that longed for independence and defiance. That position was more than a career turning point. The cause was ignition. The instant his years of famine and adversity erupted into flames. His childhood suffering, not knowing who he really was and feeling abandoned, had been turned into a force that viewers could sense in every look and every word. Hollywood was finally unable to turn away. Instead of being lavished with riches, his formative years in California were marked by hardship, isolation, and a resolute unwillingness to give up. And Jack Nicholson's journey from B-movies to the edge of legend was fueled by an unwavering fire that was created out of pain. The rise appeared inexorable from the first time Jack Nicholson burst into Hollywood's consciousness with Easy Rider. But beneath the roar of cheers, a more subdued, delicate tale was being told. He made his first Academy Award nomination for Best Actor in 1970 at the age of 33 with a powerful performance in 5 Easy Pieces, establishing himself as one of the most powerful voices of his generation. In 1973, at the age of 36, he duplicated the accomplishment with The Final Detail, capturing the unadulterated, restless essence of America during a period of dissatisfaction. The year that would permanently inscribe his name in the annals of film history was 1975. Not only did Nicholson receive his first Oscar at the age of 38 for his performance as Randall McMurphy in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It turned into a reflection of revolt itself. It was praised by critics as thrilling. People in the audience cried. It was also a vindication for Nicholson. He once acknowledged, "Every actor is haunted by something, and if you're lucky, you can turn that into something people can feel." The world witnessed triumph, and he knew it was pain transformed into art. The victories kept coming, each one bigger than the last, until Nicholson fell into the madness of The Shining in 1980 under Stanley Kubrick's unwavering vision. Here's Johnny. Nicholson later admitted that he had drawn from shadows already inside me. By the late 1980s, he was more than just an actor, he was an institution. A line improvised in a frenzy of brilliance became etched into the DNA of pop culture. A performance so captivating that it redefined the very language of horror. The world saw terror. At the age of 52, Nicholson had not only taken over Hollywood but also shaped it to his will. However, he was far from done, and in 1997, at the age of 60, he gave one of his most sensitive and human performances in As Good as It Gets, which earned him his third Oscar. Nicholson's portrayal of the Joker in 1989's Batman was evil, operatic, unforgettable, and the $60 million payout that followed made industry history. His acceptance speech that night was full of humor and gratitude, saying things like, "I'm honored to be on any list with you, Bobby, Dusty, and my old bike buddy Fonda." But beneath the humor, there was a hint of something more fragile. Friends whispered about his loneliness, about a man who was loved by millions of people but occasionally sat restlessly in silence when the curtain fell. He had 12 nominations, 3 Golden Victories, and the kind of record that guaranteed his place among the immortals. In the quiet, Jack Nicholson was still Jack, but to the world, he was the storm, the genius, the legend, the force of nature that transformed suffering into cinema. This was the cruel paradox of his glory, that the same intensity that electrified audiences and gave birth to unforgettable characters also carved fissures inside him. A pantheon of roles that changed cinema forever, 12 Oscar nominations, 3 Golden Victories, haunted, searching, carrying the hollow carved in childhood. The more brilliant the triumphs, the deeper the shadows seem to fall. But the unchangeable truth endures, even the brightest light casts the darkest shadow. The first step on that staircase was his marriage to Sandra Knight, the only woman he ever formally called his wife, the only time he came close to the kind of ordinary happiness most men take for granted. If Jack Nicholson's career was a ladder of gold climbing toward immortality, then his personal life was a staircase that kept collapsing beneath him. In 1962, at the age of 25, Nicholson was not yet a household name. Their daughter Jennifer was born a year later in 1963, and for a brief moment it seemed that Jack had escaped the shadows of abandonment, creating for himself the intact family he never really had as a boy. However, in the night, he found what appeared to be an anchor, a fellow performer whose beauty, grace, and warmth seemed to offer him the stability he had long been denied in his fractured childhood. The same fire that made him unstoppable in Hollywood proved uncontrollable at home, as Nicholson's passion for art, restless ambition, and refusal to be bound by routine began to erode the marriage almost as soon as it had taken root. He would later confess in a rare interview that, for a while, I thought I'd finally broken the chain of my own past. I thought I could hold on to it. Even though she acknowledged the tenderness they shared in those early struggles, Sandra later described their years together as turbulent, shaped by Jack's refusal to be tied down. By 1968, just 6 years after they exchanged vows, the marriage quietly dissolved. There was no courtroom drama or tabloid scandal, only the silent pain of a young family torn apart before it had a chance to truly begin. Jack revealed years later that leaving left him a man with more questions than answers, a rare glimpse into the regret he usually kept hidden behind charm and wit. For Jennifer, who was only 5 years old, it meant growing up without her father's constant presence. The very traits that made him a legend on screen cost him his chance to be a husband and full-time father. Friends and colleagues frequently said that Nicholson carried an unconscious awareness of this failure, though he rarely addressed it directly. His roles as rebels, outsiders, and men who refused to be contained seemed to mirror the cruel symmetry of his private life. After decades of being stripped of his bluster, he admitted, "I sometimes wonder if I threw away my one real shot at family." He went on to enjoy a life full of beauty, renown, and passion, but he never again stood at wedding altar or whispered forever to anyone. The one secure home he may have had was lost, and that shadow followed him into old age. Jack was aware that he had previously experienced the simplicity of everyday love but had let it elude him, despite the world's celebration of him as a cinematic giant. It wasn't a headline or a controversy. However, it was the scar that never fully healed for Nicholson, a silent reminder that even legendary people can lose the things they need most. If Jack Nicholson was already troubled by the loss of a potential family after his marriage to Sandra Knight ended, the years that followed left him with an even deeper scar, one that had nothing to do with romance but rather with parenting. Nicholson's performance in 5 Easy Pieces in 1970, which garnered him a second Academy Award nomination, solidified his status as one of the generation's defining voices. Susan Ann Spach, an actress with a powerful presence and uncompromising independence, was one of his co-stars. Although their brief off-screen relationship may have seemed short-lived, it spawned a story that was far more important than any movie. Caleb, a son, was born. For the majority of males, the birth of a child is a life-changing event that offers the opportunity to mend past hurts with fresh life. For Nicholson, it turned into a crack that mirrored the wounds from his own childhood. Later that year, Caleb was born, but Jack didn't come forward to greet him. He stayed away, whether it was from fear, uncertainty, or the all-consuming fire of a career suddenly exploding into the stratosphere. He did not acknowledge the child in public. In private, the quiet deepened into a gloom that persisted for many years. Susan, who later spoke of Nicholson's refusal to take responsibility, took on the job of parent by herself. It appeared to be a harsh turn of events to the outside world. The performer who so eloquently portrayed outcasts and rebels on TV had abandoned the most important and commonplace job of all, fatherhood. It was a sharp irony. Growing up in the shadow of family secrets, Nicholson thought his grandparents were his parents and his mother was his sister. He had personally experienced the pain of bewilderment and the pain of being absent, yet history kept repeating itself. He transferred the very doubt that had plagued him by failing to acknowledge Caleb. People close to Nicholson whispered that he was more troubled by remorse than he ever acknowledged. He occasionally sidestepped the topic in interviews, but occasionally a glimmer of candor leaked out. In his own words, "There are things I wish I had done differently." Over time, Nicholson did offer assistance, and Caleb's role in his life gained some recognition. 7 words that carried the weight of decades. However, the early absence persisted like an unseen scar that no gesture could completely remove. For both detractors and supporters, the paradox was unavoidable. Jack Nicholson's portrayal of truth on TV was so powerful that it left many feeling deeply shocked. He battled with realities too personal to confront off-screen. The boy he had never claimed from the start served as a silent reminder that Nicholson's humanity was still incomplete, despite his success in Hollywood. It was a tragedy written in quiet rather than a scandal that made headlines. Once born, a quiet that could never be totally undone. If the pain of absence was left by Jack Nicholson's early fatherhood, his connection with Michelle Phillips in the middle of the 1970s brought about yet another heartbreaking chapter that was more subdued and private but no less tragic. Both beauty and turmoil had an impact on Phillips, the ethereal voice of the mamas and papas. Together, she and Nicholson appeared to be a couple of restless souls drawn to the same artistic and rebellious spark. However, their brief union would be remembered for a sadness too great to put into words, rather than as a lifelong tie. The death of a child before their life had really started. During those years, Nicholson was making quick ascents to the top of Hollywood. His career was ablaze with roles that changed the film industry and Oscar nominations. But few people ever noticed the pain that soaked into his private world behind the veil. Unlike so many of his subsequent relationships, the pregnancy and its abrupt, terrible end were never portrayed in the media or made headlines. Instead, it was an unspoken anguish. It was the agony of bearing and then losing life for Michelle. For Nicholson, it was just another crack in the brittle family dream that he never seemed to be able to achieve. After that, friends who knew them talked about the sadness that lingered between Jack and Michelle. An unsaid sorrow that could not be soothed by praise, wealth, or celebrity. Nicholson hardly ever talked about the loss. However, others who watched him saw how it affected him in ways he rarely disclosed. The death of this unborn kid added to the paradox of a man's life, which was already plagued by the absences of his early years and his separation from his son Caleb. A legend who was praised for giving stories life but was powerless to save the life that would have brought him closer to love. It was a private grievance, a hurt suffered in silence, rather than a scandal that was widely reported by newspapers or a chapter that Hollywood gossips gorged on. It exposed Nicholson's most human side in many respects. In his private life, the man who had the ability to transform suffering into thrilling art was impacted by the same tragedies that affect everyday people. There was no altar or permanent union left over from the brief affair with Michelle Phillips, but there was something more durable. Time would never be able to completely remove the shadow of a loss. Angelica Houston was the hurricane that dominated Jack Nicholson's horizon for almost 20 years, if his romantic relationships were hurricanes, unforgettable, stunning, and fierce. She was his equal as well as his lover from 1973 to 1990. A steely and elegant woman. The daughter of John Huston, a legendary figure in Hollywood, who had her own fire to match Nicholson's charm. Angelica was the one person who recognized him not as a star but as Jack, flawed, restless, smart, and vulnerable, for a guy who had spent his childhood surrounded by secrets and abandonment. They led a public dazzling love story together. But behind closed doors, its light was tinged with darkness. At its height, Nicholson's career was booming, with each job advancing him in the pantheon of immortals. But that also brought excess, temptation, and an uncontrollable restlessness. Angelica put up with a companion that could be incredibly tender one minute and treacherous the next, something that many others could not. She would later describe the heartbreaking cycle of waiting for him to come back, knowing he might not, in her novel Watch Me. She would admit, I was often humiliated, but I loved him. The paradox, a love that is both intoxicating and wounding, binding and breaking, was captured in her words. She stood by him for almost 17 years, hoping that one day chaos would give way to love. However, the last fracture occurred in 1990. Angelica suffered an irreversible blow when Nicholson fathered a child with model Rebecca Brossard. It was more than just adultery. It was the breakdown of a shared life. After over 2 decades of development, their story came to a close in quiet that was more weighty than any disagreement. Houston called that period of time shattering. And all his bluster, Nicholson was never able to absolve himself of the guilt. He said, I lost the best woman of my life, and I never forgave myself, in one of his most painful admissions. Those are the words of a naked man, not the lines of a screen role. They disclose that there was a wound behind the mythology that no Oscar could heal and no Cheers could cover. It was more than just losing a partner when Angelica passed away. It was losing the only thing that kept him steady. The one love that may have calmed the internal turmoil. This romance left a scar that throbbed through his latter years, a private pain concealed under the facade of charm, in contrast to other romances that blazed and dissipated. And the tragedy lies in that. Jack Nicholson was aware of it. He was aware that the only lady who had matched his fire with her own had been lost. Even though the world hailed him as the king of film, he was aware that he had ruined his own opportunity for a long-term relationship. He was immortal in the eyes of spectators. He was plagued by himself. Millions of people cheered, but Angelica Houston's absence will always be felt. This was the love tale that broke hardest and burnt brightest in Jack Nicholson's life. The shadow of that loss has never really gone away, even after decades have gone by. A reminder that the loss of the love they were unable to maintain, rather than their adversaries, has the power to destroy even legends. If Jack Nicholson's 17-year romance with Angelica Houston ended with a bang, then Rebecca Brossard's was followed by a protracted, painful reverberation. She was a model whose youth and radiance appeared to promise Nicholson something he had never really achieved: regeneration. She was radiant and over 30 years younger than him. When the storm with Houston subsided in the late 1980s, Rebecca showed up, bringing with her what appeared to be a second chance at the family Jack had lost. Nicholson gave birth to a daughter named Lorraine in 1990 when she was 53 years old. Ray, a son, was born 2 years later. For a guy who had previously. Their appearance was both thrilling and intimidating as they stumbled through the pain of absent fatherhood. A reminder that fate had given him another opportunity to cherish what had previously escaped his grasp. The very fire that made Nicholson unique, however, also made him challenging to control, as history had demonstrated. He was still surrounded by Hollywood's roles, celebrity, and temptations. Even though Rebecca gave him sensitivity and youth, she was unable to calm a guy who was always on the go. Their passionate connection had flaws from the beginning, reflecting the same restlessness that had destroyed his previous relationships. The union was discreetly disbanded by the middle of the 1990s. There was only the gentle pain of a young mother leaving and a legend once more discovering his impermanence. There was no public scandal or tabloid battle. For Nicholson, the loss represented the breakdown of what would have been his greatest redemption as well as the end of another romance. Friends recalled his enthusiastic remarks about Lorraine and Ray attending their events, praising their skills and even making a joke about them being the best production he had ever seen. Even so, there was a dark side to the humor, the lack of a secure home and the understanding that his kids would grow up lovingly but without the whole family he had hoped to have. Angelica Houston, Sandra Knight, and now Rebecca were all part of his life. And the echo was the same each time. Gained devotion, lost devotion, and a man forced to face his loneliness. In rare, unguarded moments, Nicholson himself admitted the consequences of his decisions. "The fire that propels you can burn you," he acknowledged quietly. A sentence that seemed more like a tired fact than a confession. Although he loved Lorraine and Ray and frequently referred to them as the focal point of his later years, he also understood that his failure to maintain a committed relationship meant that he would always return home to an empty house. This chapter was characterized by silence rather than scandal. A quiet weighed down by what could have been. As a result, Nicholson's relationship with Rebecca Brossard is still bittersweet. He became proud of the 2 children she gave him. However, she also signaled the end of his last genuine opportunity to have a family. There is no greater irony. The guy with 12 Oscar nominations, 3 wins, and a career that will last a lifetime, Jack Nicholson, had twice come close to constructing the house he had always dreamed of, and twice he had seen it disappear. Though less dramatic than Houston's, Brossard's loss served as a reminder that legends can garner worldwide acclaim. But even legends can fail at love when the lights go out. And no victory can ever mend the wounds their failures left. The decades that followed did not bring calm to Jack Nicholson's already troubled love life, rather, they brought a whirlwind of short-lived romances that only served to exacerbate the darkness. Rumors about his relationship with supermodel Kate Moss added a bit of tabloid fire in the mid-1990s, but it was extinguished as soon as it started. He and actress Lara Flynn Boyle had an intermittent relationship during the late 1990s and early 2000s that was more characterized by turbulence and public attention than enduring affection. His name was soon associated with actress Paz de Lerda in the early 2000s, adding another chapter to the lengthy list of passions that briefly shone before fading into obscurity. These women appeared to outsiders as evidence that Nicholson was the quintessential Hollywood outlaw, a man too alluring, too restless, and too wild to be restrained. However, the reality behind the flashbulbs was much more grim. These relationships served as a reminder that even a man who was loved by millions of people could not maintain a lasting relationship. They were not conquests. Like lightning, each affair was dramatic, dazzling, and impossible to ignore before abruptly disappearing into darkness, leaving the skies over Nicholson's secret world quieter, more lonesome, and heavier than before. And a pattern becomes painfully obvious when one takes a step back and charts the course of his life. The person he would one day refer to as the best lady of his life, Angelica Houston, his girlfriend of over 17 years, nonetheless had the worst scar of all. The misfortunes that exacerbated his loneliness were grouped around that anguish. In the 1970s, the heartbreak of losing a pregnancy to Michelle Phillips. He initially avoided the extended quiet and accountability with Susan Anspach and their son Caleb. Sandra Knight and the ephemeral promise of a conventional family in the 1960s. And the fleeting promise of reconciliation with Rebecca Brossard, whom he had 2 children with in the 1990s but was unable to maintain. Nicholson fathered 6 children with 5 different women during his lifetime, leaving a legacy that spoke of fragmentation and impermanence in addition to passion and vitality. In subsequent interviews, Nicholson would acknowledge that his decisions had a significant financial cost. He admitted, "There are things I wish I had done differently." Decades of sorrow, love, and absence slid through his fingers, and a line waited. By his twilight years, Nicholson had 3 golden statues, 6 children bearing his name, and 12 Oscar nominations, but no lasting companion by his side. And that's possibly his story's most relatable fact. Hollywood is conquerable by talent. The world will adore someone with charisma. But even the brightest star is left alone when the lights go off if he lacks loyalty and accountability. The mythology of Jack Nicholson is ultimately about more than just genius and defiance. It serves as a warning story as well, reminding us that while celebrity can fill a theater, it cannot fill the emptiness of a home. At one point, Jack Nicholson's mere presence had the power to shake a theater. He had a power that seemed almost superhuman when he arched one eyebrow, burst out laughing, or spoke with a volcanic anger. He was a hurricane that audiences paid to be carried away by, a manifestation of anarchy. However, storms, no matter how severe, pass quickly. The guy who once personified insanity and rebellion in American movies started to gradually, almost imperceptibly, fade into silence by the early 2000s and 2010s. The retreat was finished by 2013. The titan of his era, Nicholson, had disappeared from the Hollywood scene. The gap he left behind was filled with rumors. Rumors of dementia, memory loss, and the sharpening of a once bright mind. In whispered tones, friends revealed that Jack had lost the ability to identify familiar faces. That the man who used to light up a room with his charisma now found it difficult to follow the discourse. The quiet was deafening to fans. His friend and contemporary, actor Peter Fonda, broke what the world already feared in 2017. Quietly, almost in secret, Nicholson had retired. He didn't receive a standing ovation, a final performance, or a crowning part to ensure his posterity. He vanished like an extinguished flame, leaving behind nothing but emptiness instead of closure. This disappearance was more than just retirement for a guy who had made his name by assuming the roles of others and living fiercely and truthfully on film. It was a curtain that dropped without cheering, a sort of living death. Once the storm, Nicholson now lingered like a ghost within his Mulholland Drive estate, while Hollywood, his arena, faded into a far-off echo. The glimmers that appeared were nearly intolerable. He was seen standing on a balcony in Los Angeles in 2023 using a long lens. The mischievous smile had vanished. It was replaced by a tired figure with bent shoulders and disheveled hair wearing a crumpled orange t-shirt. Fans weren't stunned by the pictures because they revealed age. Everyone ages, but they demonstrated surrender. This was not the man who had previously used a glance to dominate entire generations. This person was gazing off into space as though he was looking for parts of himself that were out of reach. The image was devastating to those who had marveled at the Joker, shuddered at Jack Torrance, or cried at Randall McMurphy. A gloom has replaced their storm. However, the greatest cruelty was the betrayal of the mind rather than the weakness of the body. To forget is to gradually fade away, to see one's individuality turn into a mist. For Nicholson, whose brilliance had been his memory, his intuition, and his capacity to create art out of personal suffering, the gradual loss of memory was like witnessing quiet eat away at the very center of his being. Friends who saw him talked on how sad it was. The unfathomable burden of seeing a man who used to know entire scripts by heart now stumble over a name, a face, or a straightforward conversation. However, sickness itself could not have been the most profound trauma. It was solitary. Once surrounded by people, children, lovers, and admirers, Nicholson reached old age alone. None of the 6 children he had with 5 women lived under his house. The greatest woman in his life, Angelica Houston, was no longer there. Rebecca Browser, Michelle Phillips, Susan Anspash, and Sandra Knight had all died, leaving behind memories but no lasting impact. In his later years, Jack was frequently by himself, with a large house and a limited social group, and the sound of voices had given way to quiet. The loneliness was devastating for a guy who had so powerfully drew the world to him. Thus, we are left with Jack Nicholson's story's most fundamental conundrum. He was eternal on screen. He appeared to be too strong, too vibrant, and too electrifying to ever fade. Off-screen time diminished him, just as it diminishes everyone. Human, weak, unsure. His downfall is more than just his personal misery. We are being held up a mirror. A reminder that a person's spirit cannot be protected from the gradual encroachment of age by an abundance of accolades, money, or praise. To observe Nicholson's decline is to face the frailty that lies at the heart of all genius. The understanding that even the brightest sun must set, leaving only twilight instead of thunder. Nevertheless, this finale contains a final piece of silent poetry. Possibly Nicholson, who once became his non-public wounds into unforgettable cinema, now gives us one last lesson in silence. That glory fades. That even legends cannot outrun mortality. And that what endures isn't the roar of reputation, but the fragile humanity under it. Jack Nicholson, the storm who as soon as shook Hollywood to its center, is now a whisper. And that whisper, fragile, fleeting, fading, is the sound of all of us. The truth that even giants ought to at some point bow to time. And yet, whilst time had taken his power, it could not erase the fortune and legacy he had built. For while Nicholson withdrew into silence, the empire he created nevertheless stood. Mansions, artwork, and wealth that regarded almost mocking inside the face of his solitude. His internet worth, anticipated at almost $400 million, speaks to the surprising achievement of a person who as soon as seemed unstoppable. From his legendary mansion on Mulholland Pressure overlooking Los Angeles to estates in Malibu, Shasta County, and even a retreat in Hawaii, Nicholson's houses form a constellation of luxurious across the Yank landscape. Within the one's walls hangs an art series worth over $150 million. Works by way of Picasso, Matisse, Rodin. Treasures of centuries collected by using a person who should have the funds for beauty in all its bureaucracy. In his garages sit the logos of flavor and electricity, a Mercedes-Benz 600, a Bentley Mulsanne, a Variety Rover. But, none of those riches can fill the silence of his domestic. Nicholson, who as soon as thrived at the electricity of crowds, now chooses seclusion, closing the doors of his mansions towards a global that after adored him. It's far the sharpest paradox of all. The man who regarded to possess the entirety now lives with the one factor wealth cannot purchase. Companionship, permanence, peace. No castle, no masterpiece, no device can bridge the space between luxurious and loneliness. His fortune, wonderful although it's far, has emerged as less a triumph than a monument to absence. These days, Jack Nicholson lives nearly entirely out of sight in the same Mulholland Drive home he has owned for decades. Buddies communicate of lights glowing faintly in the night, of a discern every now and then glimpsed on the balcony, however hardly ever extra. He seldom attends public activities, though every so often he seems at basketball video games along with his son, Ray, one of the few constants of his later years. Those moments, fleeting but tender, advocate that amidst the decline, fatherhood stays his final bond to the residing international. Pals have spoken quietly of his frailty, the thinning frame, the silver hair, the slowed gait. Extra painful nevertheless are the whispers of memory slipping away, of names forgotten, of tales blurred. For an artist who as soon as commanded whole scripts with fiery precision, to lose memory is to lose self. The greatest wound of his vintage age, but, may not be disorder, however the solitude it brings. From an Oscar legend to an vintage guy by using the window, this is how some describe the evaluation, a reminder that the applause of tens of millions cannot melt the silence of an empty house. What aches most isn't always the dimming of the body, but the fading of one's own remembrance, the cruel forgetting of the very existence one has lived. And yet to degree Nicholson handiest with the aid of decline is to miss the overall reality. Past the heartbreaks and solitude, his legacy remains enormous and plain. He became by no means simply an actor who spoke strains. He often reshaped them, leaving fingerprints on scripts like The Departed. He became no longer handiest a performer but also a dedicated collector of art, curating a gallery that rivals museums. Quietly he gave to causes funding AIDS research, supporting diabetes foundations, contributing to the LAPD, helping children through the Casey Lee Ball Foundation. In the back of the mask of the Hollywood insurrection turned into a man who sought splendor, who gave, who believed in artwork's strength to outlast him. This perhaps is Nicholson's most human revelation, that a man may additionally falter in love, may additionally bring regrets, may additionally stay in solitude, and yet nonetheless leave behind contributions that undergo. His life, messy and glorious, wrong and luminous, is evidence that greatness is not the absence of weakness, however the courage to convert it into something larger than oneself. He changed into a seeker of beauty, a purchaser of causes, a craftsman of unforgettable cinema, and for all his loneliness, he turned into in no way without impact. Jack Nicholson's story is each triumph and tragedy. A man who climbed to the summit of Hollywood, who held the sector in thrall, yet who faced the same fragilities that bind us all. He's an everlasting image of cinematic power, but additionally a reminder that no wealth, no repute, no applause can erase the innermost human needs for love, loyalty, and belonging. His life teaches us that brilliance can dazzle, however it cannot shield the coronary heart from loneliness. That even legends are human, that even the brightest lighting forged the darkest shadows. And so we appearance returned with gratitude. Gratitude for Randall McMurray, for Jack Torrance, for the Joker, for every role that seared itself into reminiscence. Gratitude for the person who became his personal chaos into artwork that moved tens of millions. Gratitude for a legacy that even in silence nevertheless speaks. If certainly one of Nicholson's performances ever touched your coronary heart, percentage that reminiscence. A scene, a line, a second that lingers. In doing so, we write the following chapter of his story together. A chorus of remembrance for a soul of cinema, a good way to never honestly fade. Jack Nicholson might also have stepped far from the display, but inside the hearts of those who watched him, he remains everlasting.